SUA, the strangest thing about being a family secret is that everyone knows something is wrong, but nobody will tell you what it is. I was 69 years old when I finally admitted something I had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. My name is Margaret Carter, and from the day I was born, there was always a silence surrounding me that nobody could explain. Growing up in a small Ohio town, I learned early that every family had stories. There were stories about how my older cousins met their spouses, stories about grandparents arriving from different states, stories about holiday disasters that became family legends. Yet whenever the conversation drifted toward my birth or my earliest years, the room changed. It happened so often that I stopped believing it was a coincidence. At family dinners, someone might be sharing old memories when I would ask a simple question. What was I like as a baby? The answer never lasted more than a sentence before someone changed the subject. My mother would suddenly remember something in the oven. My father would ask someone about football. My aunt would start talking about the weather. As a child, I accepted it. Children do not always recognize what adults are hiding. They simply learn which questions make people uncomfortable. By the time I was a teenager, I noticed other things. There were dozens of framed photographs throughout our house. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and family vacations. Yet somehow there seemed to be very few photographs of me before the age of 5. I remember standing in the hallway one afternoon staring at the collection of pictures on the wall. My brother appeared in almost every stage of childhood. So did my cousins. But there was a gap where my own earliest years should have been. When I asked my mother about it, she smiled and said some photographs had been lost during a move years earlier. The explanation sounded reasonable. Still, something about it never felt right. The older I became, the more examples I noticed. During family reunions, relatives sometimes exchanged glances when certain topics appeared. At Christmas gatherings, conversations occasionally stopped the moment I entered a room. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious enough to confront. Just small moments that left me feeling as though I had arrived in the middle of a discussion I was never meant to hear. Eventually I married, raised a family, and built a life of my own. My son David grew into a good man. He married a woman named Rebecca who was intelligent, confident, and outspoken. Together they created a happy life. Looking at them, I often promised myself I would never allow secrets to grow in. After that birthday gathering, I could not stop thinking about the album. The image of my relative closing it so quickly replayed in my mind again and again. It was not the movement itself that bothered me. It was the expression that followed. For years, I had seen discomfort. I had seen hesitation. What I saw that day was different. It looked like fear. A few days later, I drove to visit my Aunt Eleanor. At 87 years old, she was the oldest living member of our family. If anyone knew the truth, it was probably her. We sat together in her sunroom overlooking a small backyard garden. She poured coffee while we talked about ordinary things. The weather, her health, my son David, his wife Rebecca. The conversation remained pleasant until I finally asked the question that had been following me for decades. Aunt Eleanor, why does everyone get uncomfortable when people talk about my early years? The smile disappeared from her face almost immediately. She looked down at her coffee cup. Margaret, that was a long time ago. My heart began beating faster. It was not an answer, but it was more than I usually received. That is not what I asked, I said gently. She remained silent. Several seconds passed. Then she changed the subject entirely. We spent another hour discussing everything except the question I came to ask. When I drove home, I realized something important. People do not avoid harmless topics for 70 years. They avoid painful ones. That realization changed the way I looked at my past. Over the following weeks, I began noticing details I had ignored for most of my life. I searched through old family photographs stored in boxes inside my basement. Hundreds of images passed through my hands. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, school events. Yet the pattern remained impossible to ignore. Before the age of 5, I barely existed. There were scattered photographs, but nothing like the collection that existed for every other child in the family. One afternoon, I spread dozens of pictures across my dining room table. David happened to stop by that day. He looked at the photographs and asked what I was doing. At first I hesitated. Then I told him the truth. I think everyone has been hiding something from me. He laughed softly. Mom, maybe you are overthinking things. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But then I showed him the photographs. One by one. The gaps, The missing years. The strange absence that surrounded my earliest memories. His expression slowly changed. By the time he finished looking through them, he was no longer smiling. That is odd, he admitted. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged what I had noticed for decades. A few nights later, Rebecca invited me to dinner. During the meal, I casually mentioned my conversation with Aunt Eleanor. Rebecca immediately became interested. Unlike many members of our family, she had not grown up around the silence. She looked at the situation with fresh eyes. "What if there are records somewhere?" she asked. "What kind of records?" I replied. "Birth records, hospital records, old documents, something." The suggestion seemed obvious once she said it. Yet somehow I had never considered it. For years, I assumed answers existed only inside other people's memories. That evening, after returning home, I sat alone in my study thinking about what Rebecca said. Around midnight, I found myself opening old filing cabinets and storage boxes. Most contained ordinary paperwork, tax records, insurance forms, property documents. Then, tucked inside a worn manila folder, I discovered something unexpected. It was a copy of a family tree created decades earlier by a distant relative researching our ancestry. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I noticed something strange. My name appeared in handwriting different from the rest of the document. It looked as though it had been added later. I stared at the page for a long time. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe not. But for the first time in my life, I felt certain of one thing. The silence surrounding me was not my imagination. It was real. And somewhere beneath decades of missing answers, a story was waiting to be found. The discovery of the family tree changed everything. For nearly a week, I carried a copy of that document with me wherever I went. During breakfast, it sat beside my coffee cup. In the evening, it rested on the table next to my chair. The more I studied it, the stranger it seemed. Every name on the chart appeared to have been written by the same person using the same pen, except mine. My name looked darker, newer, added later. It was a small detail, but once I noticed it, I could not ignore it. Rebecca became just as curious as I was. A few days after finding the document, she came over with a folder and a laptop. We spread everything across my dining room table and began comparing dates. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Rebecca pointed to something I had overlooked. "Margaret, look at this." She tapped a line on the family tree. The date listed beside my birth did not match the date written on an old church record we had located among family papers. The difference was only several months, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. "That cannot be right," I said quietly. Rebecca frowned. "Maybe it is a mistake." I wanted to believe that. Yet deep down, I already knew we were moving beyond simple mistakes. Too many things were beginning to point in the same direction. Later that week, I visited the local historical society where many old county records had been preserved. I told myself I was only gathering information, nothing more. But as I searched through archived documents, I felt a growing sense that I was approaching something important. Hours passed. Most of what I found seemed ordinary. Birth announcements, marriage records, newspaper clippings. Then I came across a yellowed article from the year I was born. The article itself had nothing to do with me. It described a community fundraiser held at a church outside town. What caught my attention was a photograph accompanying the story. Several members of my family appeared in the picture. My parents were there. My grandparents were there. Yet according to the date printed beneath the photograph, it had been taken during a period when my mother was supposedly home caring for a newborn child. Me. I stared at the image for a long time. Something did not fit. When I returned home, I called Aunt Eleanor again. This time, she sounded tired before I even asked a question. "Margaret," she said softly, "some things happened a long time ago." The statement immediately raised more questions. "What things?" I asked. Silence filled the line. Finally, she sighed. "You were looking in places people hoped you would never look." My heart pounded. "Why?" Another long pause followed. Then she said something that left me speechless. "Because once you know the truth, you cannot unknow it." Before I could respond, she gently ended the conversation. That night, I barely slept. I sat awake in my living room watching shadows move across the walls while her words echoed in my mind. Once you know the truth, you cannot unknow it. The next morning, David stopped by unexpectedly. I told him about the phone call. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Mom," Everybody seems to know something except you. Hearing someone else say the words out loud felt strangely painful. Because it was true. For nearly 70 years, I had been standing in the center of a story while everyone else possessed pages that were missing from my copy. As evening approached, I opened the old filing cabinet one more time. Hidden behind several folders was a sealed envelope I had never noticed before. There was no stamp, no address, just 3 handwritten words on the front. For Margaret. My hands began to tremble as I stared at it. Whatever answers I had been searching for all these years suddenly felt much closer than I was prepared for. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope resting on my dining room table. The paper looked old, not fragile enough to fall apart, but old enough to have been hidden for many years. My name appeared on the front in handwriting I immediately recognized. It belonged to my mother. Seeing those letters sent a chill through me. My mother had been gone for more than a decade. Yet suddenly it felt as though she was sitting across from me, waiting for me to make a decision. I called David first. Then I called Rebecca. Within an hour, both of them were sitting at my dining room table. The envelope remained unopened between us. Are you going to read it? Rebecca asked quietly. I looked down at it. I do not know. That answer surprised even me. For most of my life, I wanted answers. Now that answers might finally be within reach, fear had appeared beside curiosity. What if the truth changed everything? What if it changed nothing? David reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Whatever it says, you do not have to face it alone. Those words gave me enough courage to finally break the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long. The paper had yellowed with age. At the top, in my mother's handwriting, were the words I never expected to read. Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way to you. My heart immediately began racing. The room felt smaller, the silence heavier. I continued reading. The letter did not reveal everything at once. Instead, it spoke about fear, about mistakes, about choices made long ago by people who believed they were protecting someone. My mother wrote that many members of the family knew parts of the story. Some knew more than others. But everyone agreed on one thing. They believed keeping silent was the kindest option. I stopped reading and looked up. Kindest for who? I whispered. Nobody answered because nobody knew. I continued reading. The next several paragraphs described a difficult period before I was born. Financial struggles, family pressure, worry about public judgment in a small community where everyone knew one another. The details raised more questions than answers. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop completely. According to the letter, the story I had been told about my earliest years was incomplete. Entire sections of my family history had been intentionally omitted. I felt as though the floor had shifted beneath me. Rebecca leaned forward. What does it say? I looked at her. It says there is more. That was the frustrating part. The letter hinted at the truth without fully revealing it. My mother repeatedly referenced conversations that had never happened, decisions that were never explained, names that appeared without context. It felt less like a confession and more like a map leading towards something else. Then I reached the final page. At the bottom was a single sentence written separately from the rest. If you want the complete story, talk to Eleanor. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, David broke the silence. Your aunt knew all along. I nodded slowly. Suddenly, our recent conversations made sense. Her hesitation, her warnings, her refusal to answer direct questions. She was not avoiding the truth because she did not know it. She was avoiding it because she had promised someone she would. The following morning, I drove to Aunt Eleanor's house before I could talk myself out of it. She opened the door and immediately looked at the envelope in my hand. The color drained from her face. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. We sat together in the same sunroom where she had avoided my questions only weeks earlier. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated the letter resting on the table between us. Finally, after nearly 70 years of silence, my aunt looked directly into my eyes and said the words I had been waiting my entire life to hear. Margaret, it is time you knew why the family spent so many years pretending part of your story never happened. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Aunt Eleanor sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap, while the afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor between us. I had imagined this moment hundreds of times throughout my life. I expected shock. I expected anger. Instead, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of calm. After decades of wondering, I was finally sitting in front of someone willing to speak. Eleanor took a slow breath before beginning. "Your mother loved you more than anything," she said. "Before we talk about anything else, you need to understand that." I nodded. "Then why did everyone spend so many years hiding things from me?" Her eyes filled with sadness. "Because people thought they were protecting her. And eventually they convinced themselves they were protecting you too." The answer only deepened the mystery. Eleanor looked toward the window for several seconds before continuing. She explained that when my mother was young, our family faced enormous pressure from relatives, neighbors, and the expectations of a small community. Reputation mattered. Appearances mattered. Certain situations were discussed openly, while others were buried as quickly as possible. According to Eleanor, decisions were made during those years that shaped the rest of my life without my knowledge. "The family agreed never to speak about it again," she said quietly. "That was the arrangement." My heart tightened. What was the arrangement hiding? Eleanor hesitated. I could see the struggle on her face. Even now, after all these years, breaking the silence clearly hurt her. Finally, she reached for a small wooden box sitting on a shelf beside her chair. I watched as she carefully placed it on the table. The box looked old and worn from decades of handling. "Your mother gave this to me many years ago," she said. "She told me to keep it safe." Slowly, she opened the lid. Inside were photographs, letters, and official documents tied together with a faded ribbon. The sight alone made my pulse quicken. Eleanor picked up one photograph and handed it to me. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. The image showed my mother as a young woman standing beside another woman I had never seen before. They looked remarkably similar. Similar enough to be sisters. Yet I had never heard anyone mention her. "Who is she?" I asked. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Her name was Caroline. The name meant nothing to me. Yet the emotion in Eleanor's voice told me it should. One photograph became another. Then another. Everywhere I looked, this mysterious woman appeared. Family gatherings, holiday celebrations, community events. She seemed deeply connected to our family. Then suddenly, she disappeared from the photographs entirely. The timeline felt disturbingly familiar. One moment present, the next erased, just like parts of my own history. "Why have I never heard of her?" I asked. Eleanor swallowed hard. Because after a certain point, nobody was allowed to mention her anymore. The room fell silent. My thoughts raced as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Then Eleanor handed me a folded letter. Unlike the letter from my mother, this one was addressed to someone else. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I opened it. Halfway through the first page, I found my own name. I stopped breathing for a moment. The letter had been written shortly after I was born. More importantly, it discussed decisions involving me. Decisions being made by adults while I was still an infant. My eyes moved across the page searching for answers. Instead, every sentence seemed to create new questions. When I finally looked up, Eleanor was watching me carefully. There were tears in her eyes. "Margaret," she said softly, "you have spent your whole life believing you knew who belonged in your story. The truth is that one of the most important people was removed from it before you were old enough to remember." As those words settled over me, I realized I was standing at the edge of something much larger than a hidden family disagreement. Whatever happened all those years ago did not just create silence. It erased an entire person from the history I thought I knew. The drive home from Aunt Eleanor's house felt unreal. The photograph sat on the passenger seat beside me, along with the letters and documents from the wooden box. Every stoplight seemed to last longer than normal. Every mile gave me more time to think about the woman named Caroline. Until a few hours earlier, I had never heard her name. Now she occupied every corner of my mind. By the time I reached my house, I knew one thing with certainty. Caroline was not some distant relative. She was connected to my story in a way nobody wanted me to understand. That evening, David and Rebecca came over again. We sat around the dining room table while I carefully laid out everything Aunt Eleanor had shown me. The photographs immediately caught Rebecca's attention. "She really does look like your mother," she said. She was right. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same eyes, the same smile, the same posture. If someone had told me they were sisters, I would have believed it instantly. David spent several minutes reading through the documents before finally looking up. "Mom, who exactly was Caroline?" I wished I knew. The frustrating thing was that every piece of evidence seemed to circle around the answer without actually revealing it. Then I remembered something. One of the letters mentioned a church outside town, the same church that appeared in the old newspaper photograph I found at the Historical Society. The next morning, Rebecca offered to come with me. Together we drove to the small church that still stood on the edge of the county. The building looked almost unchanged despite the passing decades. Inside, an elderly administrator listened patiently as I explained what I was researching. At first, she doubted any records from that period still existed. Then she disappeared into a back room. Nearly 20 minutes later, she returned carrying several old ledgers. My heart raced as we carefully turned page after page. Baptisms, weddings, community events, years of local history preserved in fading ink. Then Rebecca suddenly touched my arm. "Margaret." I looked where she was pointing. There, recorded in a church membership list from the year before I was born, was Caroline's name. Directly beneath it was my mother's name. The two entries were listed together, not merely as relatives, as members of the same household. I stared at the page in disbelief. According to every story I had ever been told, my mother grew up with only one sibling, a brother. Caroline had never existed. Yet here was proof that she had. More importantly, she had been close enough to my mother to share the same address. The administrator noticed my reaction and quietly excused herself, giving us privacy. Rebecca continued examining the ledger while I searched through additional pages. Several entries later, I found another reference. This one was far more shocking. It mentioned a special prayer service requested by the family following a personal tragedy involving Caroline. No details were included, just her name and the date. I quickly compared the date to information in the letters from Eleanor's box. My hands began trembling. The date matched the period shortly before my birth. Suddenly, the scattered clues started forming a pattern. Caroline disappeared from photographs. Caroline disappeared from family stories. Caroline disappeared from official conversations. Yet every trail led directly back to the months surrounding my arrival. As we drove home, neither Rebecca nor I spoke much. We were both thinking the same thing. Whatever happened to Caroline somehow changed the course of my life before I was old enough to remember it. That evening, I called Aunt Eleanor again. This time, when she answered, there was no hesitation in her voice. It sounded almost as if she had been expecting my call. "You found the church records," she said before I could speak. I closed my eyes. "Yes." A long silence followed. Then Eleanor said something that made my entire body go still. "Margaret, Caroline was not removed from your family's history by accident. She was removed because every time people spoke about her, they were forced to remember the truth about where you came from." For several seconds after Aunt Eleanor spoke, I could not find my voice. The words echoed through my mind with a weight that felt impossible to ignore. Every time people spoke about Caroline, they were forced to remember the truth about where I came from. I sat in silence holding the phone while decades of unanswered questions seemed to gather around me. Finally, I whispered, "Tell me." On the other end of the line, Eleanor took a slow breath. When she spoke again, her voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. "Caroline was your mother's younger sister." I closed my eyes. Part of me had already suspected that much. The resemblance in the photographs had been undeniable. Then why erase her? I asked. Another pause followed. "Because after you were born, the family decided it would be easier to erase one story than explain it." The sentence struck me harder than I expected. Easier for whom? Easier than what? Eleanor invited me to visit the next morning. This time, David and Rebecca came with me. None of us wanted more phone calls or half answers. We needed the full truth. When we arrived, Eleanor was waiting in the sunroom. The wooden box sat on the table beside several additional folders I had never seen before. It looked as though she had spent the entire night preparing for this conversation. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Eleanor opened one of the folders and removed a photograph. It showed my mother and Caroline standing together on a front porch. Both women looked young. Both were smiling. Looking at the image, it was impossible to imagine that one of them would eventually disappear from every family story. Eleanor gently placed the photograph in front of me. "Your mother and Caroline were extremely close," she said. "Closer than most sisters." She paused before continuing. "When Caroline faced a difficult situation as a young woman, your mother stood by her. Unfortunately, not everyone else did." The room remained silent. Eleanor carefully chose each word, as though she was walking through fragile memories. Then she revealed the truth that had been hidden for nearly 70 years. I was not my mother's biological daughter. I felt my breath catch in my chest. Even though I had spent months uncovering clues, hearing the words spoken aloud felt completely different. Eleanor reached across the table and touched my hand. Your mother became your mother in every way that mattered, she said softly. But she did not give birth to you. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized they were coming. Across the room, David sat frozen. Rebecca looked equally stunned. For a moment, nobody knew what to say. Then the next question came naturally. Caroline, I asked. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Suddenly, everything began making sense. The missing photographs, the strange dates, the altered family records, the uncomfortable silences. Caroline was not merely a forgotten relative. She was my biological mother. Eleanor explained that after my birth, circumstances within the family became complicated and painful. Decisions were made by older relatives who believed they were protecting everyone involved. My mother chose to raise me as her own child. Caroline Eve. The days that followed felt unlike anything I had ever experienced. For nearly 69 years, I had carried questions without answers. Now I carried answers that created entirely new questions. I knew who Caroline was. I knew why her name disappeared from family conversations. I knew why people became uncomfortable whenever I asked about my early years. Yet understanding the truth did not immediately tell me how to feel about it. Some mornings I woke up grateful. Other mornings I felt sad for the years that had been lost. Mostly, I felt overwhelmed by the realization that an entire chapter of my life had existed just beyond my reach. David and Rebecca stayed close during that time. They called often. They visited frequently. More than once, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with old photographs spread out before me while they helped sort through decades of family history. For them, the discovery was shocking. For me, it was life-changing. One evening, Rebecca asked a question nobody else had dared to ask. Do you know what happened to Caroline after she left? I looked down at the photograph in my hands. The truth was that I did not. Aunt Eleanor had explained how the family separated from her story, but there were still gaps. Caroline had become my biological mother in name, yet she remained almost a stranger. The next morning, I called Eleanor again. Her voice sounded gentler now that the secret was no longer hidden between us. When I asked about Caroline's later years, she became quiet. She wrote letters, Eleanor said. For a while, my heart skipped. Letters? Yes. Eleanor paused. Most were never shared. The statement hit me harder than I expected. Somewhere, there might be letters written by the woman who gave me life. Letters I had never been allowed to read. That afternoon, Eleanor invited me back to her house. When I arrived, she handed me a small bundle of envelopes tied together with ribbon. The handwriting matched the name I had seen in the old documents. Caroline. My hands trembled as I carefully opened the first letter. It was not dramatic. There were no shocking revelations. Instead, it described ordinary things. The weather, a new apartment, a job. Yet woven between those details was something else. Love. Every few paragraphs, she asked about me. Was I healthy? Was I happy? Did I enjoy school? Had I learned to ride a bicycle yet? I sat silently as tears rolled down my face. The woman I had spent months searching for had never forgotten me. Even from a distance, she had remained connected to my life in every way she could. I spent hours reading those letters. Some were joyful. Some were filled with longing. All of them revealed a person the family had worked hard to erase, but never truly succeeded in forgetting. That realization changed something inside me. For years, I believed I had been excluded because I was unwanted. The truth was almost the opposite. The silence existed because people were trying to manage emotions they did not know how to explain. It was not right. It caused pain, but it was different from rejection. Later that evening, David and Rebecca came over again. This time, I shared everything. The photographs, the letters, the story. They listened carefully as generations of hidden family history unfolded across my dining room table. When I finished, nobody spoke for a moment. Finally, David looked at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, he said softly, none of this changes who you are. His words settled into the room like sunlight through a window. He was right. The discovery changed my understanding of the past, but it did not erase the life I had lived. My mother was still my mother. Caroline was still part of me. Both truths could exist together. For the first time since this journey began, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because every question had been answered, but because the silence that haunted my entire life was finally beginning to disappear. In the months that followed, I continued reading every letter Caroline had written. Some evenings I sat by the window for hours, moving slowly through pages that had waited decades to be read. The experience was emotional, but it was not what I expected. I thought I would feel anger. I thought I would feel resentment toward the family for keeping the truth hidden for so long. Instead, I found myself feeling something far more complicated. I felt compassion. The more I learned about the circumstances surrounding my birth, the more I understood that the people involved had been imperfect human beings trying to navigate difficult choices. Some choices were wise, others were not, but none of them could have imagined how long the silence would last. One afternoon, several weeks after the truth came out, David and Rebecca invited me to dinner. We gathered around their dining room table, sharing a meal and talking about ordinary things. At one point, Rebecca looked at me and smiled. "You seem lighter." I thought about that for a moment before answering. She was right. For most of my life, I carried a weight I could never identify. A quiet feeling that something did not fit. A sense that I was standing outside a locked room while everyone else held the key. Now the door was open. The room was no longer mysterious. Some parts of what I found inside were painful. Other parts were beautiful, but at least they belonged to me. Later that evening, after dinner ended, David handed me a framed photograph. At first, I did not recognize it. Then I realized what I was seeing. Someone had carefully restored one of the old pictures from Eleanor's collection. The photograph showed my mother and Caroline standing together years before I was born. For the first time, both women existed in the same frame of my life. Neither hidden, neither erased. Tears filled my eyes as I held it. "I thought it belonged with you," David said quietly. I brought the photograph home and placed it on a shelf in my living room. Every morning afterward, I saw it as I drank my coffee. It became a reminder that truth does not always arrive to destroy something. Sometimes it arrives to complete it. A few months later, Aunt Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. Before her passing, we shared several long conversations. During our final visit together, she apologized for remaining silent so many years. I remember taking her hand and telling her something I genuinely believed. "You gave me the truth when I was ready to hear it." She smiled through tears. Neither of us needed to say anything more. After her funeral, family members gathered together. For the first time in my life, Caroline's name was spoken openly. Stories were shared. Memories resurfaced. Photographs appeared from attics and closets. It felt as though an entire person was being welcomed back into the family after decades of absence. As I listened, I realized something remarkable. The secret that had shaped so much of my life no longer controlled it. It had become part of our history rather than a shadow hanging over it. Today, when I look back on this journey, I do not think about the years of silence as much as I think about what finally ended them. Curiosity, courage, and the willingness to ask questions even when the answers feel frightening. The truth did not change the woman who raised me. She will always be my mother. The truth did not erase the life I lived. It simply revealed another person whose love had quietly followed me across the years. Most importantly, the truth gave me something I never realized I was missing. It gave me the complete story. For nearly 70 years, I believed I was the missing piece in my family's puzzle. In the end, I learned that I was never missing. I was simply carrying a story that had not been fully told. And once that story finally found its voice, the silence that surrounded my life disappeared forever.